Hello and welcome back to the channel. We'll be doing another simple history video about sloped armour on tanks and how it saved many lives during World War II, and I think still now they use it somewhat in the US Army. But yeah, then you can clearly see that that is the US symbol for the army there anyway. I'm going to try and use that feature more actually. I think it might help you illustrate it more since I'm not doing this on a computer. Anyway, let's get on with the video.
Sloped armor, the history of tanks. During the First World War, tanks appeared as a new type of weapon designed to break the stalemate on.
Yeah, and you have to remember that tanks in World War I actually were flat armoured and big and bulky. The Mark 8 started to kind of use sloped armour, but not as much as later on. Like, that does look like actually a Mark 8.
Battlefields of the Western Front. Even though they failed to meet the task, tanks brought about a revolution in warfare during World War II, 21 years later.
Which is why against it, and that is the Mark 5, I think, that they have currently on screen. I just dropped it.
When they first appeared, it was apparent tanks would become a dominant force on the battleground.
Well, yeah, they actually did quite a lot during World War One, but didn't do enough. And then you had in World War Two, and they knew that if there was another major global conflict, that tanks would be the deciding force. And which they were, you know, when Hitler tried to invade Russia, got quite far because he had the world's largest tank arsenal ever, you know. That's how he managed to get quite far, by reducing casualties.
But there had to be a way for the enemy on the opposite end of the tank barrel to somehow destroy or take the weapon out of action. And so began the race.
So yeah, you had the Germans. They had their with their panzers. They had the ends of their anti-tank missiles. You had the RPG, the rocket-propelled grenade by the Americans, and as well you had the Germans had a modified flare gun, which could be used as a flare gun, and a grenade launcher to destroy tanks. So that's how they actually managed to do that. And the sloped armour meant that they would ricochet off somewhat.
Between construction of the armored vehicles and construction of anti-armor weapons. As anti-armored weapons developed and became more effective, tank designers had to improve the vehicle's protection by making it thicker and harder to penetrate. Alongside this, however, was a far more innovative implementation, which achieved the same results, this being sloped.
And it stopped them from being heavier and less maneuverable around areas.
Armor. In the years before and during the early stages of World War II, the principal way of penetrating tank armor was by using kinetic energy penetrators.
Yes.
As with any other body, the kinetic energy of an anti-tank round is proportional to its mass and velocity. More precisely, it's a product of 1/2 of the object's mass and the square of its velocity. The higher one of these, the more powerful the round, and in turn its capability to force its way through the armor.
And armor-piercing rounds were created so they could do that. So armor-piercing rounds were created to go against tanks and not people, which most people actually still think they were originally designed for.
Once the round penetrates the armor, the target is destroyed by either the heat and the pressure produced or the scattering of round particles, otherwise known as shrapnel. Over time, the caliber, weight, and velocity of the anti-tank rounds increased, creating some powerful tools in combating tanks. To increase the...
So actually one of the world's largest guns is an anti-tank rifle, because the calibers are so large they need a larger and larger package. While some anti-tank missiles, like these are missiles, so they work differently to this. You had the French Vespa one, which was literally just an armoured Vespa with a missile barrel on it, and that was about it. and that was tiny. While some of these were like 6-7 feet long of barrel alone.
Tank's protective capabilities, constructors equipped tanks with thicker armor plates to match the increase.
And then here, it's eventually just like 3, 4, 5 times the size of a man, which is 6 foot roughly. If we go for some of the tallest average height of a man, and so, and the weight, you're looking at 150 pounds for you Americans. Like, no, actually, looking for about 200, which is about 75 kilos. So you have to think how heavy that would be.
Kinetic energy of the rounds. The drawback of producing thick armors was that it increased the overall weight of the tank. More importantly, it required more steel, which also meant higher production costs. Sloped armor countered this problem, as with angled armor plates, constructors achieved better protection while retaining the same thickness of the armor. Sloped armor provided more than one benefit to the protection of the tank. The most obvious was the increase of the armor thickness, more precisely, the relative or the line of sight thickness. When a round hits the armor plate, it transfers its kinetic energy along its horizontal axis.
Yes, and because of that, if it's thicker, then it will also slow down. So that's why some armors are quite thick, so that it actually slows the round down while it's moving and then stops it partway through. Or it destroys it if the armor is strong enough.
Line of sight. In vertical armor plates, the thickness along the line of sight is the actual thickness of the plate. In sloped armors, the line of sight thickness is higher than the actual and relative to the slope angle. The higher the angle of the armor slope from vertical, the higher the relative or the line of sight thickness. In 60-degree sloped armors, relative thickness is twice as high than the actual. That means kinetic energy rounds had to penetrate twice as much steel if the armor plate was upright.
And this is one thing why it would ricochet as well. But as well, if it did partly penetrate, it would also stay there. And if it stayed there, then it would act as armor itself and was then for self-fulfilling. And then you had often where like 60% was standard, but you had some were 70 and 80. And it meant that in theory, you could actually get one which at 180 degrees, which would never happen at all because it would be impractical, it would be about 10, 20 times thicker.
Most often, sloped armor plates were applied to the frontal part of the tank, since this was the most likely direction of attack. A sloped armor plate offered better protection on the given area of the tank, but provided no weight and material savings. This was largely due to the fact that compared to vertical plates, slope armored plates had to be longer to cover the same height. A combination of slope plates used to envelop.
And yes, it cost a tad bit more money, but it was cheaper than actually adding more plates, and therefore meaning on which the cost over and weight over the cost and weight of non-sloped armour meant that in theory it was cheaper and lighter to do it, meaning on which it was better for the war. And the Soviets used it a lot. The Soviets were big fans of sloped armour, and the Russians are using it now in the current war in Ukraine because of how effective it can be. And often when things are effective, they stay effective for a longer amount of time until things are produced that make it ineffective. And in this case, nothing has really been produced to do that as efficiently as sloped armour.
A section of the tank was beneficial for material savings, however. The reason being that rounder shapes have a smaller surface area relative to their volume than rectangular shapes. Therefore, making tanks with spherical turrets provided either savings in material or a thicker armor for the same amount of material. For this purpose, tank constructors use cast curved turrets, or those composed of angled plates. The disadvantage of such designs was that it made the inside of the tank significantly more cramped. By applying sloped plates, the overall volume of the tank interior was reduced as well. Soviet tanks, known for their sloped turrets, were very cramped and
So yeah, currently in the current war, the Soviets are using tanks like this. They're using old Soviet tanks. And there have been a few cases of officers actually being terrified to go into them because of the sloped turrets.
Very cramped and uncomfortable for the crew inside. Another benefit of the sloped armor was its ability to deflect the projectile. Upon impacting a vertical armored plate, the kinetic energy penetrator transfers all of its energy to the plate. This is because the direction of the penetrator is perpendicular to the surface of the target plate. In the case of sloped armors, due to the inclined surface of the plate, only part of the penetrator's kinetic energy is transferred to it, thus reducing its penetrating power. This is when the occurrence of deflecting or ricocheting is possible. The lighter
and often happens on modern armors, which are very strong. Now, modern armor is much more strong because we have different materials, but then the steel was much more weak, which has now meant that they have managed to almost not need sloped armor as much anymore.
and slower a projectile is, the greater the ability of sloped armor to deflect it. Such was the case with armor-piercing shells in World War II, bullet-shaped kinetic energy penetrators with relatively low velocity. If you want to experience their side's tank militia, visit the world.
So yeah, anti-tank rifles more. Anti-tank bullets and rifles, armor-piercing bullets, don't work as well on sloped armor because they are much slower.
Biggest tank museum and see how it matches up to your World of Tanks specialized design. 7 days of premium access. Along the plate, partially deflect. Difficulty when designing the sloped armor came about when it was discovered that the way the projector would impact the armor plate was very difficult to predict.
Yes.
Instead of deflecting, the round could slide along the plate, partially deflect, change the path inside the armor, or get bent upon impact. Whatever the case was, however, the sloped armor would
The slide was the best one. The partial deflection just meant that it would damage to the armor sometimes quite significantly and render it useless in that area. The path changing just meant it would go through anyway and destroy it. And the bending meant that it was a partial deflection and it would bend the bullet so that it wouldn't work properly either, and may render it useless again.
will provide better protection than vertical armor. The first ever tank to utilize slope armor was Leonardo da Vinci's famous war car. His design showed cone shapes used in the upper areas of the vehicle. The first modern tank to apply the sloped armor was the French 1917 Schneider CA-1, which used a sloped frontmost section.
But they didn't know of the benefits. They were just doing it to save cost. And this was just one of the benefits of it.
Of the hull, the so-called glacis plate. Sloped armors were also used in some of the first armored cars, typically with much thinner armor plates. Examples of these being the Russian Gebharov Renault and the British Lancaster armored car.
Yeah.
The most distinctive armored car of the interwar period with almost entirely sloped bodywork was the German SD KFZ 2.
Yeah, so it's very famous because it was completely sloped, which meant that it had the added benefit of deflection and so on, but it had the negative of the fact that it was heavy because you need more armour to then cover the same amount of area, and it was more expensive because of that, and it looked stupid.
31. In this same time period, the first tanks entirely built on the principles of sloped armor appeared. These were the French Saumur S-35 and the Renault R-35, both having sloped armor
I love the card logos on these tanks.
made of cast steel. The use of sloped armor saw more extensive use during World War II as the conflict and weapon technology progressed. Arguably, the one actual example of an almost perfect utilization of the sloped armor was the legendary Soviet T-34 tank.
Yeah, and that tank is actually currently being used in the current war because of the armour. and the Russians having no supplies.
When it first entered service in World War II, its armor was groundbreaking. Sloped armor plates were used on all four sides of the hull, with the front plate mounted at a perfect 60-degree angle from vertical. The T-34's turret was cast steel, with sloped sides, and the back was round-shaped. Even though the quality of the manufacturing was, at the best of times, questionable,
the manufacturing was rubbish, honestly, but it worked. It worked, and it was a proof of concept, and actually a relatively good tank for the time.
The armor of the T-34 was probably the best there was at the time. In the early stages of the war, a single T-34 came under heavy fire from a German 37mm PaK-36 anti-tank gun. The German crew reported to have to fire 23 rounds against the Soviet tank and only managed to jam the tank's turret ring. German Panzer III tanks with the 37mm Kampfwagenkanone 36 tank gun were also almost useless against the T-34s.
Yeah, so a lot of these anti-tank guns against the T-34s didn't work because they weren't used to the armor, so they didn't know how to go against it. With them not being able to know how to go against it, they just had to adapt what they already had.
German tank crews noted that their guns were effective at only short ranges, aiming from the flank or rear, and getting a direct hit as perpendicular to armor plates as possible. Being leaders in using sloped armor, the Soviets used the design on almost all of their tanks, including the T-60, T-70, and later the IS-2 and IS-3 heavy tanks.
And them two are still being used in the current war again. Like, a lot of these Soviet technologies are still being used because, not because they're good, but because the Russians don't have anything else.
The success of the Soviet sloped armor design impressed the Germans, who had their first experience in dealing with the now often feared T-34. Their most powerful tank, the Tiger I, had an entire bodywork composed of flat welded armor plates,
which meant that the bullets would just go straight through because they weren't expecting to go into the war. And given Germany's technologies, and which they didn't know about, because there was lack of communication between the Allies, it meant that in theory it wouldn't work.
However, the German engineers, realizing the effectiveness of sloped armor, implemented a completely different design on its successor, the Tiger II. It had a hull made of sloped armor plates and a rounded turret. The lessons they learned about sloped armors in the first years of the war on the Eastern Front, the Germans applied to other tank designs, most notably on the tank destroyers Jagdpanther and Jagdpanzer 38T Hetze.
Ugh.
Jagdpanzer 38T Hetze. The Allies, too, used slope armors in their armored vehicle designs. Angled armored plates were used on Shermans, M10 tank destroyers, and the majority of the armored cars and troop carriers. As the war went on, the sloped armor began losing its advantages, primarily due to improved large-caliber anti-tank guns. For example, the German 75mm PaK-40 anti-tank gun and Tiger's 88mm guns could penetrate T-34's frontal turret at ranges of 3,900 feet or 1,200 meters at practically any angle. By the end of the war, it became evident that sloped armors were becoming obsolete, especially when new types of anti-tank rounds entered the scene. Rounds with shaped charges, and especially the high-explosive anti-tank rounds, could relatively easily penetrate.
As you had the Panzerfaust, you had the RPG, the grenade launchers. You had. I'll remember its name soon.
Steel armor plates, regardless
if not,
of
then
the
it just
thickness
won't
and
be on here.
angle. The development of these rounds revolutionized anti-tank warfare. Tanks became vulnerable to new weapons that an infantryman could carry, rather than fixed weapons requiring a crew to operate. The basic principle of increasing the protection of the armor by inclining it was now no longer enough. Those designing the next generation tanks had to develop or refer to new materials that could withstand the impact of high explosive rounds. This led to the introduction of new types of armor, such as ceramic armors, composite armors, and reactive armors. many of which are still used in modern tank designs.
The A1 Abrams uses ceramic armor. Well, that's the end of the video, so remember to like, subscribe and all that, and like, subscribe to Simple History. Honestly love these guys. Yeah, like and subscribe to them and me, and bye.